Despite the long-standing personal friendship between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, as well as their shared ideological stance against America's power and global influence, by the end of the current decade, some experts believe we could very likely see a war break out between Russia and the People's Republic of China. Even though both nations have autocratic governments opposed to any sort of international order led by the West, the China-Russia relationship is still not without points of contention. Most visibly, perhaps, is their ongoing dispute over territory in Russia's Far East. Russia and China are both continental powers. They both also happen to be tied for the nation with the most neighbors, each sharing a border with 14 other countries. And throughout their respective histories, both Russia and China have expanded and contracted their borders, dominated territory and been pushed back, which has led to countless border disputes. Were this current disagreement to escalate to an armed clash, however, to snowball into a wider conflict, it would not only undo their current strategic partnership, but it would further destabilize the whole of Eastern Eurasia. Over the past decade, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have met more than 40 times, working to strengthen an alliance that remains complicated yet appears strong. They've even gone so far as to refer to each other as dear friends. Last year, however, China initiated a subtle yet serious land grab of disputed territory along Russia's far eastern border, perhaps most notably the Russian port city and former military outpost of Vladivostok. Vladivostok is the largest Russian port on the Pacific Ocean and the chief cultural, economic, scientific, and tourism hub of the Russian Far East. And so when Beijing decided to add the city's Chinese name, Haishanwei, to its current maps, this did not sit well with Putin. But this is not a new technique. China has created maps and fictitious histories to assert territorial claims against neighboring countries before. Putin, however, might not respond as rationally or diplomatically as other nations have in the past. Giving Chinese names to cities in long-established Russian territories could be viewed as Beijing's attempt to passive-aggressively reassert its claim to some of Russia's thinly populated regions bordering northeastern China and Manchuria, most of which were ceded to the Tsars during the Qing dynasty in 1860. In one way, Beijing is letting Moscow know that it's not forgotten about the vast swathes of land it still regards as historically Chinese. Moscow, on the other hand, might see this as a clear violation of their agreement, known as the Sino-Russian Borderline Agreement, which was signed by the foreign ministers of both countries in 2008. Given its track record, though, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia isn't the only country China has unresolved border issues with. In fact, Beijing has a long history of drawing its borders according to its own design, altering previously agreed-upon maps by adding Chinese names alongside foreign names in brackets, perhaps in the hope that no one would notice. At the moment, China is involved in territorial disputes with virtually all of its neighbors. This includes its highly public standoff with Taiwan, its ongoing disagreement with the Philippines over the Spratly Islands, which China claims belong to the PRC, along with just about everything else in the South China Sea. Not to mention its long-drawn-out disputes with Japan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. China's revisionist approach to geography even extends to historically Indian lands across the Himalayas. This more recent move to quietly absorb Vladivostok is simply its latest attempt to redraw certain borders that it claims were unfairly drawn in the first place. Back when the treaties dividing up these lands were signed, China had no real bargaining power, which is why some experts believe that China has simply been bottling up its grievances against Russia and that someday soon these will reassert themselves, even if each new Chinese leader, starting from Jiang Zemin, has assured everyone that the Russian-Chinese border question is officially closed. Is it though? Many experts remain unconvinced. Take, for example, similar past name changes like that of Aigun, now known as Aiwi Town, located in the northeastern part of Heilongjiang Province, situated on the Chinese side of the Amur River, which forms the border between China and Russia. In this case, China had the right to change the town's name because of its historical significance. This still led to some controversy. For this was where, in 1858, representatives of both nations met to sign a treaty that would transfer territory on the Amur's left bank to Russia. Beijing attributed the change to commercial interests of the local government, mainly encouraging tourism, and not as a slight to their Russian comrades, and the matter was settled for the time being. This should give you some idea of the historical weight being dragged behind this current dispute over Vladivostok, aka Haishanwei. For even if China and Russia are presenting a united front against the US and its allies right now, their history is more complex and hostile than you might think. Based on a string of past treaties, Russia has maintained its position that all the islands in the Amur, Argun, and Ussuri rivers belong to it, while China has long asserted that the dividing line actually runs through the middle of the rivers, meaning that according to China, the ownership of each island is based on its location relative to the middle of the river, with some even being proportionately divided up. And it's this not-so-small difference of opinion that has led to violence between these two nations before. Before they ultimately clashed in 1969, tensions between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China had been simmering for years, fueled by ideological differences, competition for leadership within the communist world, and various territorial disputes. What set things off, however, was the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968, or more precisely, the doctrine the Soviets used to justify it later. Introduced by prominent Soviet politician Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, the Brezhnev Doctrine gave the Soviet government the right to overthrow any socialist or communist state it believed to be too liberal or that had drifted too far from its definition. This was understandably concerning to Chairman Mao Zedong, who rightly saw the new doctrine as ideological justification for a Soviet hypothetical future invasion intended to overthrow him. Tensions peaked, and what would come to be known as the Sino-Soviet border conflict erupted. Starting with a series of skirmishes, the most significant occurring on Zhenbao Island, known as Damansky Island in Russia, the fighting lasted for several months, with both sides suffering a number of casualties before a ceasefire agreement could be reached. But even as the fighting died down, this sudden outbreak of violence between two newly nuclear-armed states left the international community deeply concerned about the possibility of a wider war. A range of diplomatic efforts, however, including intervention by the United States, helped to prevent any further escalation. But still, the issue wouldn't be formally resolved until 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when China and Russia signed a new treaty known as the 1991 Sino-Soviet Border Agreement. After this, both sides would agree to use the main channel of each of the rivers as the primary demarcation line. The problem remains, though, that many of the larger islands split the rivers into multiple streams, making the exact location of the main channel, and thus the border, difficult to define. It also quickly becomes obvious to both countries that the closer the primary channel was set to the opposite bank, the more islands would be theirs for the taking. So naturally, Russia and China's ongoing attempts to navigate this agreement have not been tension-free. Let's take the case of Bolshoi Ussuriski Island, for example, which, on a map published in 2023, was portrayed by Beijing as entirely Chinese territory, effectively violating the agreement they'd made in 1991, along with another they'd made in 2004. Previously, it was decided that China would control the eastern half of the island, while Russia would take the western half. And while this revision could have simply been an oversight, it could just as easily be a foreshadowing of China's future plans to expand its territory. The island itself, known as Haixiazi Island in Chinese, is an undeveloped piece of land that would likely have been forgotten were it not for its strategic geographical position. Sitting at the junction of the Amur and Ussuri rivers, the island is dangerously close to Khabarovsk, the second largest city in Outer Manchuria. Also, whichever country controls the portion of the islands where the rivers converge, which at the moment is Russia, also controls the shipping routes that become critical when the river isn't frozen over. At first glance, it might seem like this area is relatively useless to China, but not only does the Amur River have considerable hydroelectric and fishing resources, which China could use to lessen its reliance on energy imports, Outer Manchuria is also one of the most populated and industrialized regions of the Russian Far East that includes two cities with over 600,000 inhabitants, Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. This essentially means that whoever controls these two cities, as well as the major sections of the rivers they're on, would have a substantial advantage, either offensively or defensively, depending on the scenario, were a war to break out between Russia and China. But how close are we really to seeing these two go to war? For the moment, Russia remains largely isolated, subject to tightening international sanctions, and as a consequence, almost entirely reliant on China for its economic and financial stability. But this growing imbalance of power and support cannot last forever, and we will likely see the geopolitical alliance between these two nations become more fragile in the future. For one, Russia may never get over its historical distrust of its expansive eastern neighbor. And two, China's persistent ambition for territorial expansion across Eurasia gives them plenty of reason not to. What we have right now is merely a diplomatic rift between Moscow and Beijing, but there's no guarantee this won't turn violent, especially if China keeps making provocative map revisions. This could, on the other hand, simply be China's way of testing a weakened Russia, and if this is the case, the next step for China might be to actually start taking strategically significant Russian territories, like the ones adjacent to China's northeastern provinces. Russia, though, would not take this lying down, meeting any amount of Chinese encroachment with military action as it did 55 years ago. Another geopolitical issue that's straining the China-Russia partnership is about the 5 former Soviet states of Central Asia: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, where Moscow's influence has been waning as China's security status and economic footprint has steadily grown. To start, in all 5 states, China has rapidly outpaced Russia as a trading partner. In 2000, for example, Chinese imports totaled less than 1/4 of Russian imports, but by 2020, they were more than double Russia's. China's exports have too grown substantially, with some $19.3 billion worth of Chinese goods making their way to Central Asia in 2020 as well. And if this trend continues, which it probably will, it could very likely undercut Russia's economic influence in the region. It's shifts in influence like this, on top of China's map revisions, that could very likely lead them to war. So to avoid this, China might have to take a more diplomatic approach to its continued expansion efforts. Chinese policymakers could try demanding that current maps be officially redrawn to correct what Beijing sees as unjust territorial arrangements that were forced upon them back in the 19th century. It could certainly try that approach, but Putin would likely say no, putting them back on the path to war. In a war, though, Moscow is going to find itself at a clear disadvantage. China's substantial economic and military growth over the past 3 decades, combined with Russia's loss of much of its Soviet-era territory and human capital, has significantly shifted the balance of power between the 2 countries. Today, China's economy is more than 3.5 times the size of Russia's, and its military is both more modern and better funded. Russia's struggles in Ukraine have also revealed the limited capability of its armed forces, which appear more effective against weaker opponents with fewer allies belonging to NATO. Faced with even a modest amount of NATO weaponry and support, Russian forces have performed quite poorly. China's military technology is not yet on par with NATO's either, but there's good reason to believe it would defeat Russia in a direct military confrontation. The wars of today are largely being decided in the air, and Russia's air defenses, which were among the most advanced in the world, have not lived up to expectations in Ukraine. On numerous occasions, Ukrainian drones have managed to avoid Russia's defenses and strike deep within the country, hitting military bases, command and control centers, even vital infrastructure. And China, which is home to several of the largest drone manufacturers in the world, including the largest, DJI, has a lot more drones than Ukraine. This suggests that Chinese forces could overwhelm Russia's air defenses with relative ease. Even so, Russia still maintains a large stockpile of missiles capable of reaching a number of Chinese cities, along with plenty of Iranian-made drones of its own. Beyond missiles and drones, however, it's unlikely Russia would win a full-scale war against China, which has a significant advantage in terms of military spending, troop numbers, and overall fighting capability. But as much as it would like to avoid war with China, this scenario is something Russia has seriously considered, even going so far as to conduct military training exercises based on hypothetical Chinese invasion of its Far Eastern territory. Evidenced by a series of war games played out between 2008 and 2014, a period of time when Putin was either president or effectively in charge of the country, there appeared to have been deep suspicion of Beijing within Russia's military establishment, even as Putin and Xi Jinping were starting to forge their no-limits partnership. After Putin came to power in 1999, China and Russia signed an agreement to 1. Never invade each other, 2. Never launch a nuclear first strike, and 3. Drop any contested territorial claims, at least for a while. Clearly though, Putin remains skeptical, adhering to a more shake with one hand, hold a rock in the other approach to international relations. In one scenario, China pays fake protesters to clash with police near the Kazakhstan border while covertly sabotaging Russian security infrastructure. Once the violence intensifies, China increases its defense production, deploys army units to the border, and accuses Russia of genocide. Another scenario, dated July 2014, focused on an invasion of Kazakhstan and Western Siberia, where China's overall aim would be expanding its livable territory, turning these countries into colonies used primarily for their resources. In recent years, however, Russia has taken a more trusting stance toward China, even including it in large-scale military drills held in the Far East in 2018 and 2022. Beijing has also been able to acquire some advanced Russian weaponry, including S-400 mobile surface-to-air missile defense systems. But still, some experts have discredited these collaborations as mere photo opportunities and parades, not joint operations of any strategic significance. Given that Russia has also been conducting exercises involving nuclear-capable missile systems near the Chinese border, it might also be safe to say that Putin hasn't completely ruled out the possibility of a conflict, one that could involve tactical nuclear weapons. But for now at least, the heads of both countries appear to have assessed that the benefits of a Beijing-Moscow alliance outweigh the costs. In fact, just weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Putin and Xi Jinping met and issued a joint statement concerning their ongoing collaboration and calling for the establishment of a new kind of relationship between world powers on the basis of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and mutually beneficial cooperation. Their alliance, they jointly claimed, would have no limits or forbidden areas of cooperation. In their statement, they also ironically and a bit hypocritically pointed out that both their nations oppose the return of international relations to the state of confrontation between major powers when the weak fall prey to the strong. With all that said though, no amount of diplomatic hand-holding can erase their long-standing dispute over the islands of Outer Manchuria, or Russia's tendency to use its power to advance its own interests at China's expense, or China's deceptive techniques for expanding its borders. In fact, many of China's leaders remain wary of Russia's reliability as a long-term strategic partner. Keeping this as well as China's sustained eagerness to expand in mind, even into the Arctic, despite pushback from Moscow, there's another important question that needs to be asked. Can Russia keep up, or will it eventually sink down to the level of junior partner? China and Russia have long portrayed themselves as equals, but as Russia has stagnated, even declined, and China continues to increase its domestic power and international influence, this image has become increasingly difficult to maintain. The truth is, Russia has lost some of its appeal as an ally, especially when it comes to resisting Western influence. In virtually every domain, economics, technology, and military power, China has surged ahead of Russia, or is rapidly catching up. And it's this growing imbalance, despite what China's or Russia's respective presidents might say, that could end up pushing the tension and mistrust that already exists between the two to a breaking point, especially if Russia starts to feel it's being disrespected or treated as a subordinate nation. Certainly as time goes by, if Putin feels he's being snubbed by his friends in Beijing, or if the Kremlin suspects it's being taken advantage of, we will likely see these two split up, even turn against each other. Currently, most of Russia's value to China comes from its energy exports. Collectively, oil, gas, and coal account for 2/3 of all Russian exports going to China. In the coming decades, however, as China weans itself off fossil fuels, a process that's already happening, this pillar of their relationship could begin to wobble. In the past, Russian military power has been a key source of its strength and influence, but economic and technological stagnation, as well as underperformance and corruption, has largely neutralized Russia's status as a useful military partner. Instead of showing the world how a superpower could easily subdue one of its smaller neighbors, the war in Ukraine has exposed the risks, costs, and potential for catastrophe that come with this sort of action. And if Beijing can't count on Moscow's help during a face-off against, let's say, the United States, if that day does ever come, Russia's inability to offer meaningful help would threaten their relationship even more. China hasn't been too pleased either with Russia's numerous military ventures, most notably its war with Ukraine that, despite Putin's promises, it can't seem to win. Russia's unchecked aggression has not only created problems for itself, weakening it economically and militarily, but has generated significant political and economic blowback for China, forcing Beijing, unwillingly, into some politically awkward situations. Chinese officials, past and present, have claimed that a cornerstone of China's foreign policy is respect for territorial integrity and non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, while claiming too, through various propaganda outlets, that it's never invaded or bullied another country. However debatable, even ridiculous, these claims might be though, Russia's repeated invasions are in direct violation of official Chinese policy, which means that by openly supporting Russia, China is contradicting its own stated values, hypothetically weakening Beijing's international credibility. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has also resulted in stronger ties between the US and its European allies, as they've banded together to support Ukraine's resistance. It's also widened the moral gap between democratic nations and authoritarian regimes, which will only serve to damage China's image and hinder its long-term interests down the road. Putin's wars have also brought on some economic pains for China, the most impactful of which has been the global rise in energy prices. Even if China, as their biggest customer, is getting a discount, many Chinese companies have also struggled to navigate around the vast number of Western sanctions placed on Russia and its affiliates. Overall, this has resulted in a series of tangible headaches for China, and yet Beijing still appears to be doubling down on its relationship with Moscow despite the costs. But perhaps this is all part of Xi Jinping's grander plan. Maybe he's counting on Russia's future dependence. As it grows weaker and increasingly isolated, Russia could very well run out of options and be forced to duck under China's protective wing. But this is one way that China could actually benefit if Russia lost its war with Ukraine. Worse than forced subservience, a decisive military defeat for Russia in a major foreign war could potentially lead to the fracturing or disintegration of the Russian state, as we saw when the Soviet Union was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan between 15th of May 1988 and 15th of February 1989. This would certainly be a disaster for Moscow, but a newly fractured Russia would leave itself wide open to Chinese expansion, especially its highly vulnerable territories in and around Outer Manchuria. While it seems improbable for now, if Russia was forced to retreat from Ukraine, we might see some areas of Russia end up as de facto Chinese colonies, especially the already contested parts of Russia's Far East, as China moved to fill the resulting power vacuum by expanding its sphere of control and access to key resources. There's also at least one way, however, that a Ukrainian victory would be bad for China. If Russia is beaten back, this would reaffirm the post-World War II certitude that borders cannot be changed by force. It would show too that the West has the staying power to defend the existing international order while sending a clear message to Beijing: keep away from Taiwan. As we wrap up this video though, we should probably look at another, likely more concerning possibility: the US being pulled into simultaneous wars with Russia and China. But if this dual war scenario does happen, as many experts are predicting, the question remains: would Russia and China stick together and put up a united front in the hope of toppling the US? As tensions with China over Taiwan increase, along with friction with Russia over Ukraine, President Biden has maintained that the current US nuclear arsenal is more than sufficient to deter outright aggression from Russia or China. Biden's optimism, however, was not shared by the Strategic Posture Commission, a congressionally appointed bipartisan panel formed to assess America's current nuclear strategy, whose report recommended that the US continue on schedule with its nuclear arms modernization program. Beginning in 2010, the program will cost around $400 billion by 2046 and will include the upgrading of all warheads, delivery systems, and infrastructure. The report also recommended the deployment of more tactical nuclear weapons in Asia and Europe, the development of plans to deploy some or all reserve nuclear warheads, and the production of more B-21 stealth bombers and new Columbia-class nuclear submarines. Yes, a high state of nuclear readiness and modernization will likely deter both Russia and China, but for how long? Interestingly, for the first time in history, the US has found itself at odds with two major nuclear powers whose individual national security interests appear to run counter to the global order. But these two also have a lot more to lose than they do to gain, especially China, by pulling the US into a war. And we must also keep in mind that despite the appearance of a limitless Russia-China partnership, there are plenty of signs of disunison. For example, on top of everything we've already discussed, China still has no intention of sending weapons and ammunition to Russia, nor have they formalized any sort of military alliance. So what happens when Beijing, who continues to face intense pressure from the West to cut off support for Russia's economy, finds it has nothing left to gain from its relationship with Moscow? Maybe this is the limit of Putin and Xi Jinping's limitless partnership and their first step toward a war. But what do you think? Are Russia and China closer to a war with each other than we might expect? How would it start? And if they did go to war, who would win? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Now go and check out why China wants to attack Russia, or click this other video instead.